Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Morco, and this is the Longhill Report. Today we are extremely fortunate to have Dave Cameron, man about town in West Brookfield, historian, writer, photographer, actor. But today he's going to be talking not about his experiences in the Spanish-American War, but as a draftee during Vietnam. Dave, it's all yours.
Thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for taking the time to set this up. Rich is well known in our town as well. Everybody in the library knows him. Everybody in the post office knows him. So he's a bit of a celebrity in our town, which is what, the last town in Worcester County on Route 9.
That is true.
Right. So I'll start with 1966. Graduated from Penn State in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, mechanical engineering, and shortly after I had 3 job offers. I decided to take the one in St. Louis, Missouri, working for a defense contractor, very well-known one, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, and I also had a job offer at Boeing. They were just starting on the 747. I received a telegram, which I still have in my possession, and out of the 2 jobs, I took the St. Louis one because it was close to my parents. So I started at McDonnell in June of '66, and best job a guy could ever have as at my age, and turned 21, went to a Playboy club with the guys. Was a fantastic existence. Had my first apartment, first steady date. Kate Smith was her name. Yeah, well, I used to get a lot of jokes from the guys in the shop. So we had 8 guys, I believe, in the shop. We could overlook the flight line, and also McDonnell at that time was making the Gemini space capsule, so that was at the other end of the airport. So I had a pass, and I could basically have my run of where I went back then. It was a really exciting place, except in October, November, I got a letter from the Selective Service Administration in Pittsburgh and St. Louis, basically changing my classification. The guy in the shop named Wally Vizanko, he was from Cleveland, Ohio, which is not far from Pittsburgh, and he kindly took me under his wing and had supper with he and his family. And Wally said, "Dave, don't worry, you're not going to get drafted." So I basically said, "Okay, Wally." And he started making cartoons of me in the shop. I have a couple of them here. He did one of me, actually a really good artist, and he has one of me basically with chest and puffed out and bandoliers with bullets all over my chest, and he called it Beetle Cameron. Then he did another one, I have it here, Rice Patty Daddy would rather fight than switch. So the guys were making a lot of fun about the whole thing. And then I got another notification from the Selective Service Board in Pittsburgh and also in St. Louis to report for a physical at the Federal Building in St. Louis. And I was a kind of a, do you remember we called it the Princeton look in high school and college? Yeah, with the button-down Oxford cloth shirts. Yeah. And I wore a tie, nice tie, and a jacket, and I did also in high school, Bishop Canavan High School in Pittsburgh, Catholic school. So that's the kind of life that I lived. And then I went down to the Federal Building, and I was one of the few white guys that was in the Federal Building. And we had to strip down to our skivvies, wait in the line, and they were doing the test on us. Which you were in the Army, you understand that that induction test. Well, I guess my blood pressure spiked because I was so nervous. So they put me on a gurney and basically wheeled me into another room by myself, a completely darkened room. And I lay on my back on the gurney, and about 20 minutes later, the nurse comes in, puts the cuff on me, and takes my blood pressure, and she goes, "You're fine." So I passed the physical. So things moved at a really, really fast rate after that. And I was in night school at University of Missouri St. Louis campus in Normandy, which was maybe 10 or 12 blocks from where I lived. So I got an induction notice, draft notice, in Pittsburgh and St. Louis at the same time. So basically I appealed that and asked them if I could please delay that until I got out of night school. I was taking Calculus 2 or Calculus 3 at the time. So they agreed for that, and then did the final. So it was the end of the school year. So that was the end of '66. Went home to Pittsburgh to see my parents for Christmas. Came back, took the final. I think we were on a trimester maybe back then. I took the final. The day after I took the final, passed the final by the way, I got drafted again in St. Louis and Pittsburgh. So I was drafted 4 times since November of '66. So I was scheduled to go in on Valentine's Day, February of 1967. So I flew back home to Pittsburgh. I was inducted down on the Federal Building on Liberty Street in Pittsburgh, and then I was off down to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training. So you go through a holding company. You recall that when you went in?
Yep.
I went into a holding company for about a week or so until they assigned us to a platoon and to a company. So I was down there for 8 or 10 weeks of basic training. Took a test. I didn't like the way I was being treated during bivouac by one of the cooks in the chow hall. And I decided at one point, this was maybe about, what was that, about 6 weeks of basic training, bivouac? Do you remember what week that was when we went through basic training, bivouac? 4th week?
3rd or 4th.
It was about the 3rd or 4th week. And this guy, basically, we had to clean out, do you remember the immersion heaters from bivouac? I had to clean out the immersion heaters, which was an extraordinarily gross job. And I got all just full of soot and everything. They were run by kerosene. They put them in garbage cans. And then I had to go back. And the cook made me clean out the grease trap in the kitchen with a tablespoon. He must have thought I was too preppy, or I spoke, with a Pennsylvania accent or something. This was in Georgia. And I decided at that moment I was not going to become an enlisted man. So they said, anybody want to go to infantry OCS? I tested for it, put my hand up, and I said, yeah, I'd love to be an officer. So that led me to basically infantry OCS down Fort Benning, Georgia. So AIT was, I think, another 2 months. And then I started infantry OCS summer of '67, and I graduated 4th of February '68. I was OCS 568, so we were the 5th class of 1968. They were cranking out lieutenants like Lickett Myers would do packs of cigarettes back then, because they had a high turnover rate in Vietnam. Second lieutenants, especially infantry, they were getting wounded and killed quite quickly. So I graduated from that, and then they did this alphabetical thing. I was in 1st platoon. They said, anybody like to go to intel school? Well, I was the guy that put his hand up. My Uncle Vincent, who was in the Second World War, he said, Dave, don't volunteer for anything. And like a stupid Irish, part Scot kid, I volunteered for everything. So I volunteered for intel school. I went up to Baltimore, Fort Holabird, and I was in intel school for 5 months. Had 30 days off. So I flew MATS flights, and I took basically a vacation before I went. I went to Hawaii for 2 or 3 weeks. Stayed in the BOQ on Waikiki Beach, was an extraordinary place. Came back home, and then I left home, I think the 22nd of July for Vietnam. And unlike a lot of previous wars, we did not fly with people that we knew from our units. We went over basically a plane full, it was a chartered plane out of San Francisco. The plane was full, it was 707, and we knew nobody else on the plane. Same thing when we landed. I landed at Bien Hoa, I think it was Long Binh province. I landed Long Binh province. Went into, again, a location.
They used to call them repo depots, didn't they?
Yeah, I think that sounds familiar, repo depot. And I waited there, and basically you don't know where you're going to be assigned. So, it was a really worrisome time, that week or 10 days. And I saw my first coconut tree, my first coconut. Vietnam smelled really bad. It was in summertime, it was the monsoons, everything was wet. And you're basically sitting there with all these other second lieutenants and some first lieutenants who are waiting to be assigned. So it was a little bit of a worrisome period of time. And finally, after 10 days, a giant guy comes in. His name was Jones. He was Captain Jones. Big guy, about 6'4". He comes in the barracks, and he hollers out, Cameron. Anybody in here named Cameron? He hollers out Cameron, and I'm sheepishly, I put up my hand, not knowing if I'm going to go up near the DMZ or down near the Mekong Delta. Well, he walks over, he shakes his hand. He was a great guy. His name was Jones. Maybe Charles Jones introduced himself. Fantastic guy. He was a doctor. He said, you're being assigned to CMEC. And I said, what's that? He said, well, he says, we do tech intel. And I said, what's in tech intel? He said, you're going to be assigned to the ordnance unit. I had no background in ordnance. You're going to be working with enemy ordnance. And I said, okay. And I said, well, how am I going to go back to school to learn some of this? He goes, no, we don't have time. You're going to be OJ, you know the term OJT?
On-the-job training?
I was going to be on-the-job training. So I went down to Tonsonet Air Base. He asked me what I did before I came in. I told him I was drafted, and I said I worked for McDonnell Aircraft on F-4 fighters, which at that time was the fastest fighter jet. It could fly 1,500 miles an hour, Mach 2. It was a phenomenal jet. And he said, well, I have something to show you. So they were having a mini TET in July, and then they had the big TET in January and February earlier in '67. So he took me out. We drove down the runway on a Jeep, which you could do back then. There was a phenomenal amount of air traffic at Tonsonet. I think might have been the biggest air base in the country. So he took me out on the they had kind of a scrap pile at the far end of, they had 3 runways on the far end of one of the runways. And there were 3 F-4s that had been basically cannibalized. They took all the engines out of them, and the canopies were gone. And they all had been hit by 122 millimeter rockets and mortar fire during TET of '68. And they had all been pushed in a pile by a front end loader. And they were all beat up. They had burned, and basically said, you want me to take your picture in front of the F-4s? And I have a copy of that here. And I said, sure. So that was an amazing contrast between where I was a year before when I was working for McDonnell in St. Louis to see these things coming out of the assembly lines. We made them for Royal Air Force and Navy with Rolls-Royce engines. We made them for the Israeli Air Force, and we made them for all 4 branches of our Army. And they came out, you know, camouflaged, all different colors with the emblems of the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, brand new fighter jets. It was exciting to see all them. And now here was 3 of them in a pile that basically had been demolished and been cannibalized, whatever they could. So that was kind of one of my introductions to the country. So he took me over to CMEC and introduced me to the whole ordnance crew and to Colonel Baker, and then it all began. So my first assignment in country, my commanding officer, Colonel Baker, sent me down to the Mekong Delta. So Vietnam is divided into 4 corps. I Corps is up near the DMZ for all you vets out there. And then there was 2 Corps, which was kind of, you know, the Central Highlands, really hilly there. And then there was 3 Corps, which was Saigon and Chu Lai, and most of the activity that was happening in the country back then. They basically the VC wanted to attack Saigon because it was the capital of the government, the Vietnamese government. And there was 4 Corps, and that's where the Mekong River dumped into South China Sea. So my first assignment was down in 4 Corps, and Colonel basically said, he said, Lieutenant Cameron, you're going down there and you're going to meet your counterpart, and there's a new cache. Cache was the word for weapons, enemy weapons that were buried in the ground. Did I talk to you about that yesterday? Well, there's a Vaseline-like material called Cosmoline. It's really thick, and they would basically take all the semi-automatic and bolt-action rifles, and they would pack it into the barrel and pack it into the receiver and wrap it with a really heavy sort of a brown cut-right wax paper, and they would bury it in the ground. And they would do that with mortars and mortar rounds and ammunition and everything, and there were 1,000 of these all over South Vietnam, and they were caches. They would bury this stuff to hide it from us so that they could be more mobile, the VC and the NVA. So I had to go down to a place called Bac Lu, and I said to Colonel Baker, I said, well, how do I get there? And he goes, well, you go over to the air traffic controller. And I said, where's that? And he goes, it's out on the air base. You got to find it. We'll give you a ride over there. And I said, well, how do I get down there? And he goes, well, you give him this piece of paper, and it was TDY, temporary duty, and on the top it had top secret on the right, and it said for a week or less in Bac Lu, and my name, Lieutenant Cameron. And then basically my family's name in case I got killed. My parents, where they lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, actually Bridgeville, Pennsylvania. So I went over to the air traffic controller. I showed him this piece of paper, and I said, I need to get to Bac Lu. And I said, how do I get there? And he goes, well, you just wait here. Go over there and sit on a bench, and, you know, there'll be a helicopter or a plane or something that's going south. So I waited for, you know, an hour, 2.5 hours, and got a ride on a helicopter. So I got a ride on a helicopter. I think I had to go maybe 150 miles or more. I don't know exactly how far it is. Went to another LZ, you know, and there were troops on the helicopter. I forget who was down in the Delta back then, but there would be Navy guys because they had a lot of what do they call those boats that went down in the rivers, river boats. So a lot of guys were you know, the Navy had a riverine force. There were some Army boats down there. I forget the name for it. So those guys would be going down to parts of the river, and the Mekong was an enormous river. It was bigger than the Mississippi. I think it started in the Himalayas. It was an enormously large river, so it had more branches on it probably than the Mississippi did, where it goes into New Orleans. So that's where all the riverine craft were. So we had to stop a couple of times there. I had to get on another helicopter, and then I had to get on a fixed wing plane. It was raining cats and dogs. It was in the middle of the monsoons. So I get on a plane. I found out later it was made in Canada, and it had an Australian crew. And in the back of it were Vietnamese women and with their kids. They wear these conical hats. You've probably seen them in all the movies, and goats. So I was the only Army guy on the plane. I was the only Army guy going to Bac Lu, and I'd only been in country maybe 2 weeks. And I sat, and it had a door that basically like a Chinook helicopter, you know, that, and like I think a C, who else? What other?
C-130?
Yeah, C-130. It dropped in the back, so you could drive on it and I guess get goats up to the back.
Get your goat, yeah.
Yeah, and
So they got your goat.
Excuse me?
So they got your goat.
They got my goat. So we finally land, and we land on this material. I think I told you about it. It's called PSP, pierced steel planking, because it was a short takeoff and landing plane. It had two big booms that came out the back with twin vertical stabilizers. So we land, and excuse my French, but the goats, you know, start defecating on the deck of the plane, and the crew chief.
Defecate's not a French word.
The crew chief is the crew chief, the Aussie crew chief, is back there, and he has his headset on, and he's getting a little perturbed, and it starts spelling like a little bit like a barn back there. So we land, and by this time he's really pissed off at the women, and he starts yelling at the kids, and he's more angry at the goats than he is with anybody else. I'm sitting in the back corner, kind of in a semi-fetal position. He's screaming at all these women, and the women start screaming, and then the kids start screaming, and I'm going, and basically, so they drop the ramp down, and he's basically telling them to get the hell off of my plane, and he's screaming at them, and the goats start making that, what's that goat noise that goats make? They start making that whinny noise, or whatever, or maybe that's horses. So they all run off the ramp and everything, because he has to clean up all the goat feces and everything. And I'm the last person. I'm sitting back there in the corner. It was kind of dark out because it was raining and the monsoons and everything. And I'm sitting back in the corner like this, and the crew chief comes up to me and he looks at me, and he didn't realize I don't think I was even on the plane. And he basically comes to attention. He goes, "Excuse me, Lieutenant," and he salutes at me. And I said, and you know what officers do? You say at ease. I don't know if that worked in the Australian Air Force. And he was apologetic, and I stood up and I walked down the ramp, and I was supposed to meet my counterpart, which was Lieutenant Truck. He hadn't arrived yet, and there was kind of a French colonial building, single-story building with ceramic tiles on the roof, and there were like a dozen or a dozen and a half. I basically guessed that they were 14-year-old boys that were kneeling down on a slab underneath kind of a roof that was attached to this other building. And I looked at him. This is how naive.
Yes, they were not around.
This is how naive I was when I landed there, and my brother was 14. He was back in the States at he was at Charval High School. And I said to myself, what are all those 14-year-old boys doing? Their hands were tied behind their backs, and they were blindfolded. And I thought, what are all those 14-year-old boys doing kneeling together? You know, and then I went over to the cache where there were mortars, you know, anti-aircraft guns, and, you know, small arms, SKSs, you know, AK-47s and things. So I'm kind of scoping that thing out, waiting for Lieutenant Truck or Lieutenant Tree to come. So, you know, it's raining like hell, so I run into the building. I'm soaked. I don't think I had my poncho with me. I had my pot, my steel pot with me. I had my M16 with me. I had a .45 pistol. which I think most officers and warrant officers carried over there. So I had my 45 with me. So, you know, and it was, you know, heavily wooded around where we were, you know, like double canopy forest and everything. So I'm a little bit on guard, and there were no Yanks around. That's what the Aussies called us. There were no American troops around. There was no Navy, no Air Force, no Army. So, you know, I'm a little anxious, and finally Lieutenant Truck shows up. He must have come in on a helicopter. So I see him, and I'm introduced to him, and he basically said, my name tag, oh, Lieutenant Cameron, you know, it's on our jungle fatigue. So I go, Lieutenant Truck, I go, what are all those 14-year-old boys doing over there kneeling? And he goes, Lieutenant Cameron, with big eyes, he goes, VC. And I'm stunned. I go, you mean like Viet Cong? He goes, yeah, VC. So that was my introduction to the enemy, which, you know, when I trained in the United States in the infantry before I went over, I thought they were like these bull-like characters, you know, like as, you know, as big as, you know, an animal. And here they were 14-year-old kids, and that was my indoctrination to the country. So, you know.
And prisoners.
And prisoners, yeah. Well, they weren't my prisoners. They were the ARVN's prisoners, which is Army Republic of Vietnam. They were Vietnamese soldiers. So that was kind of my introduction to the country. And then I went back up to Tan Son Nhut. And then for the next month, I went on the road, and they made me a CEDO liaison rep, which is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. They made me rep for that, which was the news. We were allies, and they fought in the war, which were Koreans, New Zealanders, Australians, Filipinos, ARVNs, and Thais. So that was all on-the-job training for me. And I tell all my friends today, I wasn't qualified to do any of this stuff, and I was generally always the tallest guy in the room, and I always had a good head of hair. So I always said the only reason I got chosen for those things, I really wasn't intelligent. And I said they would always say, choose a tall guy with the good hair, and that's why I got picked. That's why I got picked for a lot of these jobs. So they made me CEDO rep, and then I went out in the field for 30 days with TDY orders to go all the way up to 2 Corps. And basically, I officially became an advisor. So I was advising all of those troops that we were allied to on defenses for Soviet rockets, because the summer that I landed, 122 millimeter rockets, which were made in Russia, and 140 millimeter rockets, more of them were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was being improved, and they were asphalting part of the trail, so there were more trucks coming down with munitions. So I became sort of a, you know, a semi-expert in rockets and small arms and booby traps. We also did booby traps at CMEC. So we were part of, my address was MACV, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, SICV, Combined Intelligence Center, Vietnam, CMEC, Combined Material Exploitation Center. That was my address if my parents wrote me. So I get introduced to a guy that basically has a suit of clothes on, and he looked like a Boana guy out of a 1960s Tarzan movie. Remember when we were kids and they would wear those khaki with the big pockets and a khaki, and he had a heavy mustache, and he had kind of a little bit of Adolf Hitler appeal to him. You know, he looked like him, and he happened to have a German last name, and he had been associated with the ballistics department of a Pennsylvania police department. And he introduced himself that way. Hi, I'm George. I'm not going to tell anybody his last name. And I came to learn.
It wasn't Schicklgruber.
No, it wasn't Schicklgruber. And I met him in a Quonset. He had a Quonset hut on the northwest corner of Tan Son Nhut Air Base. And he introduced himself to me, and he said, Lieutenant Cameron, you're going to be supplying me with enemy ordnance, really good condition enemy ordnance, because that's what our unit did. We collected and classified all that stuff and sent it back to Fort Hullabird, Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And he said, you're going to be supplying me with pallet size, you know, containers of this stuff, and we're going to be taking it over to Cambodia. And he said, none of this material can be tracked to American manufacturers. So we got so much in the way captain material, because I was out in the field a lot meeting these other, you know, other allies, and we were always finding this stuff, looking for these caches of captured enemy material, because we didn't want them to basically find it, you know, and dig it up and basically ambush us, which was kind of the way the war went most of the time. So we had thousands of SKSs and small arms and M1s, you know, from the Second World War, we had Swiss-made weapons. We had Czechoslovakian. We had Yugoslavian. We had Canadian. We had French, all from the Second World War. So apparently, after the Second World War was over, the French came back and they were occupying force in South Vietnam,
Right.
North Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia, which back then was called Indochina.
Right.
And I didn't necessarily know this back then, Richard. I've since read to learn about the war and learned about the position that I had. So basically, he would cherry pick this stuff, and I would help him cherry pick it. We would put it on a pallet, and then we would fly it over to the Cambodian border, and then supply. I think we used the term clandestine forces back then, which I didn't know what a clandestine was.
Well, you remember Apocalypse Now, when they went up the river, and the guy who was the American colonel, who was leading the, I think it was probably Mong, and he's a little crazy.
Yeah.
And that was what that would probably do him.
Well, I wasn't going that far into Cambodia or
No, probably not.
or Laos. We were kind of going over the border, the South Vietnamese border. So I called him the mystery man. I didn't know at that time, and finally found out from I think Bob Reynolds, who was the first lieutenant I worked with, a couple of the other guys in the ordnance unit, that he worked for the CIA, and he didn't wear a CIA patch. We wore patches, and he really didn't acknowledge that to me. But he had always a large amount of financial resources, and he had a villa in Saigon, and he would have a party like every month or every other month, and he would invite all the officers in my group down there, and he had. And I didn't drink at all as a kid. I didn't drink, and my parents just had highballs for the holidays. And he would have all these colorful bottles. He had like a bar, and there would be sapphire blue bottles and green bottles and red bottles. He would have all these European beverages, and and as an officer, I'd go to the Oak Club. And I would drink Ham's beer, and I learned to drink gin and tonics over there, and that was the extent of my drinking. And he had all these designer beer, and he would have these phenomenal seafood. He would have shrimp that were almost as big as lobster, and I had my first jumbo shrimp, is what the Aussies called them, and I never ate like that before. And he would have these parties, and at the time. And then afterward, I learned out that he worked for the CIA, and he must have had an expense account.
Certainly.
So I got introduced to that, and after I came back from Buk Lu, I went up country, up to Tu Corps, and then I worked with the Koreans. We called them the Rocks. I stayed with them for like 2 weeks because they were one of our allies, and I briefed them on 122s, 140 millimeter rockets. Oh, and then I became kind of a semi-expert on RPG-7s, which was a phenomenal weapon. So as I mentioned to you the other day, we hired the Air Force down at Tonsillet, and they had high-speed cameras, and I was firing RPG-7s because they'd just gotten out of OCS, infantry OCS, and all the colonels, thought, well, this guy's, he can do anything. He's a new graduate from infantry OCS. So they were always testing things, and I was like the guy that would fire this stuff for them. We hired the Air Force, and and we put up sandbags, 8 feet of sandbags. And I think I helped build this bunker thing, and we wanted to see how powerful RPG-7 was, which is a 2-stage, shoulder-fired, rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Was really more sophisticated than a grenade launcher, but it was basically based on the B-40 that the Germans used during the Second World War, and then the Russians made RPG-2, single stage, and then they made the RPG-7. So they were using the 7, which was 2 stages, to basically shoot down helicopters. So basically, we tested it, and it basically could go through almost 8 feet of sandbags. Was a formidable weapon, so I would basically brief our allies on that.
Okay, we're going to have to do more of this at another time.
Okay.
I'm not going to give away what the result of the Vietnam War was. We'll get to that at the next time, because we've run out of time now. But we'll have Dave again to tell us about what happened in Vietnam, and he has more to say.
Can I say something in closing for 2 minutes when you're done?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say in closing, I never claimed to be a hero. I'm not a hero. All the heroes were the guys that were at the wall. I read 35 names off the wall, the Vietnam Memorial Wall in 2012. My best friend Jim McClare, helicopter pilot, died, was shot down in August, a month after I arrived in country. So I'd just like to salute Jim and all the 59,000 men and women that are on the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C.
Well, we want to salute them too. We're going to have you back again, Dave, to finish this. And if you want to talk more about the wall, then that would be great. Long Hill Report, and we're very grateful to Dave for coming this afternoon. Thank you.